Taking Off Emily Dickinson's Clothes by Billy Collins. First her tippet made of tulle, easily lifted off her shoulders and laid on the back of a wooden chair, and her bonnet, the bow undone with a light forward pull. Then the long white dress, a more complicated matter with mother-of-pearl buttons down the back, so tiny and numerous that it takes forever before my hands can part the fabric, like a swimmer's dividing water, and slip inside. You will want to know that she was standing by an open window in an upstairs bedroom, motionless, a little wide-eyed, looking out at the orchard below, the white dress puddled at her feet on the wide-board hardwood floor. The complexity of women's undergarments in 19th century America is not to be waved off, and I proceeded like a polar explorer through clips, clasps, and moorings, catches, straps, and whalebone stays, sailing toward the iceberg of her nakedness. Later I wrote in a notebook, it was like riding a swan into the night. But of course I cannot tell you everything. The way she closed her eyes to the orchard, how her hair tumbled free of its pins, how there were sudden dashes whenever we spoke. What I can tell you is, it was terribly quiet in Amherst that Sabbath afternoon, nothing but a carriage passing the house, a fly buzzing in a window pane, so I could plainly hear her inhale when I undid the very top hook and eye fastener of her corset. And I could hear her sigh when finally it was unloosed, the way some readers sigh when they realize that hope has feathers, that reason is a plank, that life is a loaded gun, that looks right at you with a yellow eye. So, that was a poem by Billy Collins, one of America's most widely celebrated modern-day poets. Collins was even Poet Laureate from 2001 to 2003, and many people would point to him as one of the best poets who's writing today. But if you only knew him from this poem alone, well, you'd probably have some questions. This poem makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable, myself included. On its face, the poem seems to be trying to serve two functions. On the one hand, it seems like a tribute to Emily Dickinson with very obvious allusions to some of her most famous works. For example, the tulle tippet is a reference to Because I Could Not Stop for Death, while the bonnet refers to Glowing as Her Bonnet, and those are just two of several allusions here. So that's function number one, tribute to Emily Dickinson. Function number two seems to be an appreciation for poetry itself. That is to say, an exploration of poetry is akin to the intimacy and tenderness one would use to undress a partner. And yet the poem doesn't seem to communicate tenderness, not at every juncture. The fourth stanza tells us that Dickinson stands by a window, motionless and staring at the orchard. That kind of makes the speaker's actions seem like a violation, and yet Dickinson sighs in the final stanza, suggesting some kind of pleasureful, cathartic release. Despite some of the poem's interesting features, it's giving a lot of mixed signals. Ultimately, it makes a reader rather uncomfortable. It's a strange approach, taking the actual historical figure and writing about undressing them. As an isolated metaphor, I don't hate the idea of undressing someone to represent the joy of literary scholarship, but when you throw an actual person into that mix, it immediately becomes weird. Surely there were other metaphors that would pay tribute to Dickinson all the better. But, as it would turn out, my interpretation of this poem is apparently not at all the intention behind it. This poem was meant to communicate an annoyance with the obsession around Emily Dickinson's life rather than her poetry. As Collins explained in a 2010 interview with NPR's Terry Gross,
well, I prefer the poems to the life. We have to remember that this kind of biographical curiosity would not exist if it were not for the poems themselves. And I find that the poems are pulling us into themselves and not directing us away into the life of the author. I find the poems are magnets of attraction. So there are many speculations about her, but I think the poems are self-sufficient. And I guess I grew up in an age where of literary criticism, where biographical criticism was frowned upon as a kind of something in addition to the poems. I mean, I actually at one point, when there were so many books out about speculating particularly on Emily Dickinson's sexuality, was she lesbian, was she celibate, did she have an affair, I was driven actually by all of that curiosity and speculation to write a poem called Taking Off Emily Dickinson's Clothes, in which I attempted in a kind of playful way to put the matter at rest by having sex with her.
I hadn't known this about the poem's backstory until writing this video, and it truly shocked me because Collins usually has no problem when it comes to playfulness and poetic takedowns. One of my favorite examples is his poem called Sonnet, that not only lampoons the sonnet as a form, but also makes fun of poets for writing about taking action instead of actually taking action. Taking off Emily Dickinson's clothes doesn't read as very playful, nor does it read like a lampooning of anything. It all feels like it's played straight. Granted, even if the tone were more overtly playful, I don't know if it would come off as any less uncomfortable for the reader. Again, the issue largely is taking this actual historic figure and basically violating them in writing. And let me be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with taking real historical figures and putting them in funny or interesting circumstances. Collins actually has a good example of this titled Shoveling Snow with Buddha. The problem here is the chosen circumstance. A much better poem might have been Folding Laundry with Emily Dickinson if we're so devoted to the clothing allusions in her poems. But then that would partially defeat the poem's purpose, as it's supposed to be about Dickinson's sexuality in particular. But if the poem more broadly is just supposed to be about appreciating her work instead of her life, I feel like I could keep going in this circle for ages. The point is, the poem doesn't communicate what it intends to and ultimately comes off as chauvinist and misguided as a result. If Collins wanted to express an annoyance, there were so many better approaches than this. To his credit, he at least knows how it was received.
I try to, kind of make up for this, indecent act by ending with a sort of tribute to her, some of her great lines. But this poem was not as, universally popular as you can imagine. More than one female wrote a poem called Taking Off Billy Collins's Clothes, in which that was described as a disappointing affair.
That's really funny.
Even unpleasant.
Still, I'm not going to defend this poem, but with that in mind, let's talk for a second about what the goal is behind this video. If you weren't aware, this video is a companion piece to a video I made previously called Good Poems by Bad Poets. I want to reiterate some points I made in that video, most importantly that good and bad are ultimately subjective terms, and I'm working in this video both from a place of public consensus and personal preference. I imagine it will be clear when I'm speaking from which point of view, but remember that time period and bias are important factors here. Now, back to the video. A lot of bad poems by good poets are actually in the same wheelhouse as Taking Off Emily Dickinson's Clothes. They're surprisingly horny and, as a result, uncomfortable. For example, there's this John Updike poem called Fellatio. I'm not going to read it. Aside from monetization and all that, it's just uncomfortable, and I don't want to talk about it, not here, not now. What's more, it's just low-hanging fruit. Speaking of low-hanging fruit, there's Charles Bukowski. You dedicated viewers will remember I actually included Bukowski in the video about bad poets, and it's true I don't like Bukowski on the whole. However, a lot of people would disagree with me, including very serious literary critics. Maybe the most fair thing to say is that Bukowski is someone who did something no one else was doing in poetry at the time and came up with a series of good poems as a result, despite all the not-so-good ones. But too many of his poems just read like this one to me. Dog. A single dog walking alone on a hot sidewalk of summer appears to have the power of 10,000 gods. Why is this? Okay, credit where it's due, I don't think this poem is completely irredeemable. There is certainly more intrigue here than in, say, most Insta poetry. But in comparing it to an Insta poem, I think it shares one major trait. It feels so completely unpolished. This reads more like a first draft than a completed poem. Perhaps I meant to take this poem as a joke. Maybe the fact that the speaker doesn't have a conclusion is supposed to be funny. Like Collins, maybe this poem is also lampooning other poems. But I don't think there's enough in the text to support that reading. On the other hand, it might not be a joke at all, and the reader is meant to really read into the relationship between the speaker and the dog. Why does the speaker view the dog this way? Does the speaker want to be like the dog? I feel like we need to know more about the speaker to understand why this moment is important to them, why the dog stuck out to them. And I appreciate that I can look at the poem and ask questions, but ultimately there's not enough there substantively to give me enough clues, which leaves me as a reader feeling frustrated. I remember talking about this in my Rupee Kaur video. It's more than okay for a poem to raise questions, but those questions should ultimately lead to something, a greater understanding of the poem and the human experience. And this poem does say something about the human experience, but I can't quite pin down what. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be about confidence, self-esteem, ignorance. I just can't say for sure. I feel I need to know more about the speaker. I think I've said it before in my videos, but rhetorical questions are always kind of a gamble in poetry. Often the answer is too obvious or far too broad. As such, ending on a rhetorical question, and a question so open-ended, is even more of a risk. While I expect to do some work going into a poem, it's almost like I'm expected to do all the work in this poem. It's like the poet is saying, I'm too tired to finish this concept, why don't you tell me the rest? Which again leads me to believe this poem is supposed to be a joke. I showed this poem to one of my friends, and she said she didn't like the unsurety in the phrase appears to, and I completely agree. This poem kind of feels unsure of itself. It doesn't need to say appears to, it doesn't need to ask why is this, because that question should already be implicit at the end of the poem. The poem could read, a single dog walking alone on a hot sidewalk of summer has the power of 10,000 gods. If the poem read this way, it would read all the more confident in its own premise. The reader gets to wonder why the poet thinks this without having to be asked. In the actual version of the poem, the question makes me think the speaker has more to say, but then they say nothing more. I talked about this in my video on Haley Lou Richardson's poetry collection, but usually I come to a poem to find out what the poet has to say about a certain topic. Then I get to decide how I feel about what they've said. In this poem, Dog, I ultimately feel I haven't been given enough to consider, from the speaker's perspective, the poet's, and my own. I hope you can see what I mean as I explain all this. Again, I'm not saying the poem has absolutely nothing to it, but I just don't feel it has enough. I'll repeat, it reads very much like a first draft. Still, I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts on this and all the other poems presented in this video. Let's move on to our next piece. You may have already realized it, but researching this video was actually a little difficult. The thing about good poets is that they know how to turn bad poems into good ones, and as a result, we don't often see bad poems by good poets. But in looking for bad poems by good poets, there were some surprises that popped up in the court of public opinion. In particular, The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens. Now, it might sound crazy for me to argue that this poem is any more substantive than the Bukowski piece we just looked at, but I truly believe it is. Bukowski and Williams are kind of similar in that they were sort of pioneers of simplistic language poems in their own times. But one big difference between their work, in my mind, has always been structure. I've said it before, but Bukowski's line breaks often really bother me. They seem so arbitrary, and in the tradition of insta-poetry that he is largely responsible for, they often solely serve to make the poem look like a poem. The Red Wheelbarrow, on the other hand, looks very intentionally constructed to me. Every stanza ends with a two-syllable single word. Meanwhile, stanzas 1 and 4 have 4 syllables in their first line, while stanzas 2 and 3 have only 3 syllables in their first line, creating a chiasmus effect, sort of a syllable sandwich, if you will. Emphasizing that chiasmus is the fact that our first line, so much depends, has a pattern of 2 single-syllable words and 1 double-syllable word. Meanwhile, the penultimate line is just the opposite, 1 double-syllable word followed by 2 single-syllable words. But let's actually talk about the content of the poem. In speaking with the same friend who commented on the Bukowski piece, she said this was a poem presented to her as one that was too broad and too uninterpretable. And I get that. I won't say I have the definitive reading of the poem. There are many topics this poem could treat. My friend said she heard one interpretation about communism, then an opposite interpretation about capitalism. So if this is so broad, why do I think it works where Bukowski's doesn't? Well, for one thing, this poem is actually conclusive. It's actually making a point instead of just ruminating about one. This poem feels secure in itself where Bukowski's felt too unsure. For me, the beauty of The Red Wheelbarrow is in its mundanity. Let's remove the first stanza from the equation for a moment, because that's where I think most of the meaning comes through. Consider these 3 stanzas. A red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Like I said, on their own, these stanzas are extremely mundane. It's not necessarily a common image, and yet it feels like a quintessential one, a red wheelbarrow in the rain next to white chickens. This creates a rather archetypical view of, say, a chicken farm. If these 3 stanzas alone were all that the poem held, I'd probably criticize it the same way I do Bukowski's. That's where the first stanza comes in, carrying so much weight. So much depends upon. As I said, a red wheelbarrow is a pretty mundane object, and yet, according to the speaker, so much depends upon it. To me, this poem is about how important the things are that we take for granted. You don't think of a red wheelbarrow as something that seems necessary or important, and yet when a wheelbarrow breaks on a chicken farm, suddenly it's all too clear how much depends upon that wheelbarrow. In the same vein, you might not feel necessary or important, but in reality, you have no idea how much depends upon you. I think this is the stanza that Bukowski's poem is missing. If he had replaced his rhetorical question with a stanza such as this, it would have come together for me a lot more. Or, as my friend pointed out, if it had just been more definitive, as Williams's poem clearly is. You may think I'm reading into this too much, and that I'm not giving enough grace to Bukowski because of my biases. That may very well be true. In any case, it's totally fine if you dislike Williams's poem. I completely see the point of view of someone who doesn't. But let's move from one great to another, Robert Frost. This poem is called The Gift Outright. The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by, possessed by what we now know more possessed. Something we were withholding made us weak, until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. To the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become. So, fun fact, this was John F. Kennedy's inaugural poem in 1961, recited by Frost himself. Which is just crazy to me. Like, I know that was toward the end of Frost's life, but I hardly think of him even existing at the same time as JFK. That's beside the point, though. This is one of those poems I mentioned up top, where time period has an effect on the way we read it. But even in 1961, people had problems with this poem, and I can't imagine a Native American smiling on the piece at any point in history. If you couldn't tell, this poem reads as very pro-manifest destiny. Even the opening line, "The land was ours before we were the land's," just feels kind of icky. Granted, if you wanted to be charitable, you could interpret that from the non-American angle and just look at it from the lens of humankind, but Frost kind of ruins any hope for such an interpretation with line 5, "But we were England's, still colonials." In a 2015 essay from Poetry, author Siobhan Phillips drew attention to, quote, "the poem's racist assumption of a white, European, land-owning we, and its racist ignorance of how the same Europeans worked to eradicate Native American culture and perpetuate slavery." The very crudity of Frost's trundling, plain-spoken, mostly end-stopped lines betrays insecurity rather than confidence about civilization, wonder rather than scorn at a supposedly artless and unenhanced continent. Again, if you want to look at the poem charitably, you could consider the last line, "such as she was, such as she would become," which perhaps means to say the land will return to who once inhabited it. But to further explain Phillips's statement, that interpretation still carries racism with it, as Frost describes the land as unstoried, artless, and unenhanced before the English colonials came to it. But even if you disregard content, is it a good poem poetically? Well, again, call me biased, but not really. I think there's a reason this one doesn't pop up in the echelon of Frost's work. I think some uses of parallelism are kind of interesting, while others are kind of lame. The repeated use of possessed, unpossessed, and withholding are annoying to me, and not just because I often roll my eyes at repetition. To me, a lot of the phrases just come off as very clunky. Perhaps if they were worked in with rhyme, they would come off as more satisfying, but as written, these statements are rather underwhelming. It's not to say there's no poetic value here, but when the premise alone is so objectionable, it's kind of hard to make the poetic elements really shine through. That problem is really made manifest, no pun intended, in the poem's title, The Gift Outright. To say America was an evident, obvious, absolute gift to its colonizers is really tone-deaf, even for 1961. Let's come full circle here and close things off with Emily Dickinson. It's probably sacrilegious to say anything by Dickinson is bad, and believe me, I get it, I love her as much as the next guy, but let's take a look at the poem and then I can explain. "An hour is a sea, between a few and me, with them would harbor be." So my personal frustration in reading this poem was actually kind of similar to my frustration with Bukowski's. This kind of feels like a first draft. I had a hard time interpreting what "a few" meant. I thought she meant a few hours, which didn't make sense to me. I showed this piece to my patrons, and they worked it out pretty well. When she says a few, she probably means a few other people. Ergo, time spent with other people is like a harbor from time itself. The passage of time doesn't feel so dangerous when you surround yourself with others. That said, even though we can extract that meaning, is it a good poem? Again, it might sound sacrilegious, but I don't love this one. As one of my patrons pointed out, Dickinson is capable of stronger metaphors than this. Another patron noted that this was probably just the wrong form for what she was trying to get at. As with Bukowski's, it kind of reads like a first draft. But that patron also noted something very important. A lot of Dickinson's poems were first drafts. She very famously did not publish a lot of her work because publishers often changed it. She kept most of her poems to herself, and that remained the case until the day she died. Her poems weren't meant for an audience, they were likely only meant for her, so it's hard to judge them as presentations toward an audience/reader, as was the case with all the other poems we've looked at today. Can you imagine if someone took your personal drafts and held them to the same scrutiny as your published poems? And there's actually something very comforting about that. In fact, there's something comforting in the fact that any poet can write a bad poem. Every poet does write bad poems, no matter how good they are as poets. As I said earlier in the video, good poets know how to turn bad poems into good ones. When we read their good, published work, what we haven't read is the hundreds, maybe thousands of bad poems that acted as stepping stones to get them to where they are. So remember, even Dickinson was capable of writing a bad poem. Don't be so hard on yourself when your first drafts aren't so good either. As always, I want to take this time to thank my patrons. I genuinely could not do this without them. If you want to support the channel, see videos early, and get access to the community Discord, you can join the Patreon for as little as $3 a month. If you want to support the channel in other important ways, doing all the algorithm things really does help a lot. Liking, commenting, hyping, subscribing, eating poetry books cover to cover, the usual stuff. You can also follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around this long, here's a writing prompt for you. Consider the poems we've looked at today. Taking Off Emily Dickinson's Clothes, Dog, The Red Wheelbarrow, The Gift Outright, and An Hour is a Sea. I want you to take one of these poems and write a response poem. For example, multiple poets have written Taking Off Billy Collins's Clothes to great effect, so now's your chance. You can answer Bukowski's question, you can refute Frost's view of America, you can do whatever you want. But that's my invitation to you today, so get writing.